Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Consequentialist ethics, act utilitarianism. Introduction. A small pharmaceutical company is knowing what Ed Florence, its founder, has been hoping will turn into the company's big break. After struggling financially for 15 years, the company's stock soared last fall when Ed announced a new drug that effectively controls seizures. Better still, the drug works in small doses, which appears ideal for small children. One night, as Ed is poring over a report summarizing the first 6 months of human trials on 2,800 subjects, a number suddenly grabs his attention. Although he specifically remembers hearing of more cases, the report only mentions 2 patients who developed serious gastrointestinal problems, stomach bleeding or perforations with long-term use. Delving into the files, his anxiety grows as he finds records of 8, then 10, and even more patients showing the same symptoms. Slowly, the terrible truth dawns on Ed. An actual total of 20 such patients was accidentally recorded as 2, a simple decimal error. Yet, this means that 0.7% of the subjects developed serious problems rather than 0.07%. The difference is substantial. In fact, with the uproar about Vioxx and other drugs over the past few years, Ed realizes that this difference could be enough to block his product from approval by the Food and Drug Administration. As the full implications of this rush into Ed's mind, his exasperation nearly moves him to tears. Is it going to be the fatal blow to all of his dreams? For one fleeting moment, he is tempted to disregard everyone else and just pretend that nothing is wrong. As reality sets in, Ed quickly realizes that there's much more at stake than simply his own prospects. The trials with the 2,800 patients, many of them children, are still going on. In view of the risks, shouldn't he call an immediate halt to these ongoing trials? Clearly, the answer depends on the potential consequences of his doing so compared with letting the trials continue. What would some of the likely consequences amount to? A. If the trials are suspended, then the rosy economic prospects for Ed's company will collapse, at least for the near future. At best, several more years of research and testing will be required if the drug's problems can be overcome at all. As for those taking the drug, they will lose the benefit of the drug controlling their seizures. This is not a great concern if there are other seizure drugs that cost about the same. If no good alternatives are available, however, then this will be a major loss, especially for those patients whose seizures are seriously debilitating or dangerous. B. Alternately, suppose the trials are continued. Then important additional information about the drug can be gathered, and this could contribute toward the development of a better and safer drug to help many in the future. This could also help Ed's company, although probably only in the short run. Meanwhile, those taking the drug will continue to benefit from its helping to control their seizures. However, these people will also be placed at risk, and some will even suffer from the drug's side effects. All of our actions have consequences, whether those consequences are extensive as in Ed's story or relatively limited, as when I make a thoughtless comment to someone. Consequences also have moral importance. In this chapter, we turn our attention to act utilitarianism, a consequentialist theory that remains influential today, particularly in healthcare, as illustrated above, and in social policy. The theory of act utilitarianism. In contrast with ethical egoism, act utilitarianism treats all individuals impartially. For this reason, it does not count the effects for particular individuals differently from the way it counts effects for everyone else. Its concern, rather, is with overall effects. As its name implies, furthermore, act utilitarianism focuses solely on the morality of specific acts. Roughly, that act which would produce the greatest overall utility is, by definition, right. Of course, the various acts we could choose in any given situation will depend upon the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves. The act utilitarian notion of the right act, therefore, can only make sense relative to a particular situation. This gives us the following statement of the theory. Act utilitarianism. The morally right act for any particular situation is that act which would produce the greatest overall utility in its consequences. 2 points need to be emphasized. First, it is important to understand that act utilitarianism is offered to explain right and wrong, to tell us what makes something morally right. According to act utilitarianism, producing the greatest amount of overall utility is what makes a particular act morally right. What counts as the right act, and thus as what we ought to do, will thus always simply be an objective fact, depending solely on what would generate the greatest overall utility in that situation. Second, do not forget that in assessing an act's overall utility, act utilitarianism, in contrast to ethical egoism, considers all individuals who could be affected by an act. This includes, but is not limited to, oneself. The number of individuals affected by a particular act is called the scope of that act's effects. Scope is just one aspect of an act's overall effect, however. One early utilitarian, Jeremy Bentham, identified a total of 7 aspects that he believed must be included in assessing an act's overall effect. Setting things up just a bit differently, we can make a good assessment of an act's overall effects by attending to the following 4 aspects. 1. Scope. How many individuals... Oh, I gotta highlight this shit. 1 second. Okay. Scope. How many individuals will be affected? The greater the number of individuals affected by an action's effects, the greater the scope of those effects. The greater the scope, the greater the impact on overall utility. For instance, whether Ed continues or stops the trials, all 2,800 of the participating patients fall within the scope, with some being affected positively and some negatively. In addition, most of the patients have family members and friends who will be affected as they share in the patient's progress. Thus, they must also be included as part of the scope. Further, the owners, employees, and investors of Ed's company, as well as those of rival drug companies, need to be included. Finally, all those who might benefit from the development of a better and safer drug should be considered. 2. Duration. How long would each effect last? Some effects are short-lived, others can continue a long time. The longer a given effect lasts, the more it affects the overall utility. For those whose seizures are currently being controlled by Ed's drug, and for their family and friends, the positive effects would last as long as they take the drug. The same would be true of future patients who might take the drug. On the other hand, some of those would suffer from the drug's side effects. For those who suffer permanent injury, the duration would extend for the rest of their lives. A roughly similar period of suffering probably would apply to many of their family and friends. Those who get sick and die, meanwhile, would suffer for the duration of their sickness, and their family and friends would suffer for an indefinite time afterward. The various company owners, workers, and investors would benefit or suffer for roughly as long as the effects of their financial gains or losses last. 3. Intensity. Experiences can differ in the degree of strength or force. Some desirable effects, as well as some kinds of suffering, can be very intense, others may be fairly mild. A certain kind of effect can also vary in intensity from one person to another. Thus, suppose that a number of the persons participating in Ed's drug trials no longer experience small seizures. Then these can be counted as experiencing mild relief, an effect of fairly limited intensity. For others, the drug may prevent debilitating or even fatal seizures. For these, the effects of relief clearly has greater intensity. On the other hand, those who would suffer severe pain or death from the drug's side effects must be counted as undergoing intense disutility. Similarly, the family and friends of those patients would also share fairly intense disutility, depending on their closeness to the patient. 4. Probability. We do not know the future, we thus do not know for sure what effects any particular action might produce. We can only estimate the chances as best as we can, drawing upon the knowledge and experience we have. The most reasonable way to make such estimates is to give the greatest weight to the most likely effects, whether desirable or not. As information indicates that less than 1 of every 100 patients taking the drug would suffer danger outside. Would suffer danger? There's like a typo in my fucking course pack. I think it's supposed to be outside though. Where was I? Okay. Of course, this also means that at least 99% can be expected to enjoy the drug's benefits. Because these positive effects are so much more likely, they should be given more weight than the negative effects in its determination of overall utility. As for financial advantages and disadvantages, the probabilities here are much more difficult to estimate because they also depend on market conditions. Act utilitarianism says that we should carry out that act which in a given situation would produce the greatest overall utility. To determine as best we can which act this would be, we must first identify the choices we have. Example in Ed's case, these include either letting the trials continue or calling them to a halt. Next, you need to determine the expected overall utility, subtracting this utility from utility that will be produced by each particular choice of action. We determine this for each choice by considering the number of persons affected, scope, how long each effect would last, duration, the intensity of the effects, both desirable and undesirable, for these individuals, and the probability of each effect. Once we have estimated the expected overall utility for each of our choices, we must then compare those expected utilities to determine which choice would produce the greatest overall utility. The act that will lead to the greatest overall utility is then the act that act utilitarianism says is the morally right thing to do. So for this, my teacher was explaining this in class. This is so silly. And then she gave us this example of her cheating, whether or not she should cheat on her husband by kissing another guy, one of the co-workers at like a party or something. In the first context, it was just, the scope was just her husband, herself, her 5 kids, and then Greg. And the conclusion that we came to for the morally right thing to do was for her not to cheat on Greg, not to cheat on her husband, obviously. But then she changed up the context a bit, and for the second situation, it was the same thing, if she shouldn't or shouldn't kiss Greg and cheat on her husband. But in this case, her husband was like terminally ill or bedridden, and then she had 1 child. So the new conclusion that we came to was that she should, the morally right thing to do would be to cheat on her husband, to cheat on her husband with Greg, because that's what the numbers indicated. It's like this whole chart that we had to do, with like numbers and all, about like pain and pleasure and how much we would rate it out of 10, like how beneficial would it be. So just to put that in example. So let's continue. Considerations supporting act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism has several attractions. One of its main advantages lies in its objectivity. The fact that there is always one right utilitarian answer to any moral question. This prevents act utilitarianism from placing conflicting moral demands upon us at the same time. Since for any given situation, each possible choice of action would bring about certain effects, and since those effects would include various amounts of utility and of disutility, we can nearly always be sure that one of those choices would produce more overall utility, or at least less overall disutility, than any other. Since act utilitarianism defines that act as the right act, that action is what act utilitarianism says we should do. I'm going to lay down because I'm already getting tired of reading this shit. Gosh. Well, what are you gonna do? 1 second, this thing's... Where was I? The objective character of utilitarianism is no accident because the theory was deliberately formulated as a kind of scientific moral theory. A theory that can determine moral right and wrong simply by drawing upon human experience and observation. Because of the cause and effect regularities that exist in nature, we can, through accumulated observations, learn to predict which effects may normally be expected to result from which causes. By evaluating the overall utility of those effects, we can then assess the goodness of those effects. As our experience continues to grow, we should finally be able to achieve a quite precise knowledge of what is morally right and wrong. Act utilitarianism thus promises to take the aura of mystery from ethics and place it solidly in the realm of experience. Closely related to its objectivity is act utilitarianism's impartiality. As a theory that is as a theory that was intended to help reform the British criminal justice system. Act utilitarianism. Oh, British. That doesn't mean. Act utilitarianism was specifically formulated to ignore class distinctions, which was revolutionary at the time, because act utilitarianism puts everyone on the same scope. Anyone who can feel pleasure and pain, and it doesn't matter for like your background, your social class, your gender, blah blah blah. Like, this evaluates every situation as the same, based on the consequences of it. So, because it only considers the effects of any act, whether a crime or an act of punishment, it makes no difference in act utilitarianism whether the individuals involved are high or low born, statesmen or criminals, male or female. Exactly what I just said. From most people's point of view, this impartiality is another major advantage to act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism also has the advantage of being extremely simple because it attempts to explain all of morality by using a single principle. This principle, furthermore, seems highly intuitive in at least two ways. First, act utilitarianism surely is on the right track in treating the consequences of our acts as relevant to morality. Second, act utilitarianism resonates with the psychological fact that we all seek what we consider desirable or good states and experiences, while we try hard to avoid what we consider undesirable or bad. Act utilitarianism demonstrates a great degree of flexibility as well. Although it is true that act utilitarianism must always prescribe the act that will produce the greatest overall utility, it is also true that the utility brought about by any particular act directly depends upon the circumstances. So this was also a flaw that we discussed in class, is that, well, again, with the cheating thing, like, this can be used to justify certain actions because it would benefit an individual, but then that could also lead to us justifying, like, horrible things like rapes and murders and blah 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 because of how we view it, because we view it based on consequences and the number of people it affects. I don't know if that makes any sense, or if my accent actually sounds British when I'm trying to read this thing. Where was I? The results can occasionally be surprising. For instance, while act utilitarianism might entail that telling the truth is right in one situation, in a different situation it might judge an act of truth telling to be morally wrong. The sensitivity of act utilitarianism to different circumstances is seen as a good thing by many. Despite this flexibility, act utilitarianism is not relativism, because act utilitarianism gives us one fundamental moral principle that holds for all individuals and all societies without exception. Finally, many find utilitarian theories quite generally attractive because they readily extend the moral sphere to include some non-humans. It also would include animals in the scope, which was also revolutionary at the time. Since many animals are unquestionably capable of having desirable and undesirable experiences, it appears unjustified to leave them out of our moral considerations. Thus, any utilitarian evaluation of an act that affects animal life, examples when animals are experimented upon or when animal habitats are destroyed, should normally include these animals within the scope of that act's effects. 4. Problems with act utilitarianism. Despite its attractions, act utilitarianism encounters several problems as well. The following are some of the more imposing ones. Calculation problem. We talked about this in class. Okay, I'll try to resume it from what I remember. So, calculation problem is that, as I talked about with the charts, like, we have to rate it out of 10 of like how beneficial it would be, but that all varies from person to person. So here, should I just read it? But here it puts it into context with Ed's drug trials, the thing from the beginning. I'll just fucking read it. You've probably already thought of one problem. How could anyone accurately predict all of the this too. How could anyone accurately predict all of the possible consequences along with their scope, intensity, duration, and probabilities for each choice of action? Even in our fairly simple example with Ed's drug trials, we have seen that we must weigh the benefits of the drug's effectiveness against its side effects. We must also consider the financial picture, including possible harms to Ed's company and to any investors. We must evaluate the intensity of the various possible effects and the emotional relief or pain experienced by friends and family members. We must consider the probabilities of each possible effect. Taking all the relevant aspects of the case fully into account is a daunting task. While the RACT utilitarianism guarantees that there always is a morally best choice in any given situation, how can we hope to determine which choice that best choice will actually be? Yet unless we can normally make such determinations, ACT utilitarianism won't be of much use to us. This problem has to do with the theory's practicability. Perhaps utilitarians have a satisfactory answer to this first set of difficulties. As they point out, we accumulate knowledge of cause and effect relationships as we go through life. Thanks to this ever-increasing store of experience, most of us are able to predict the expected effects of a particular act without much difficulty. Shall I change to an Irish accent? I can't really do an Irish accent, or Australian for that matter. I feel like I could distinguish Australia. How do you do... did I say Scottish? How do you do a Scottish accent? Is it more like prominent? Is this even British to you? Like crumpets and tea. I like drinking tea and eating crumpets in the morning. And beans. How do I do an Irish one though? How do I do an Irish one? Wait, what was I reading? I wasn't... okay. How do you do an Irish? No. For instance, while like... no. Shall I search up how to do an Irish accent? I'll just try and switch it up as we go. Is this offensive, by the way? I hope not. Maybe, for the atrocity of my accent, but like, whatever. For instance, while lying may bring certain immediate advantages, it usually entangles us in more complex difficulties that ultimately become troublesome for all involved. Since the resulting unpleasantness almost always outweighs the initial advantages, we quickly learn that our best choice is usually to follow the rule of thumb. Don't lie. By employing similar rules of thumb in everyday situations, we should be able to forego many utilitarian calculations. Such rules of thumb won't always lead us to the right choice, but they will do so with reasonable dependability. Moral saint problem. Another cluster of problems has to do with the extensive moral demands of ACT utilitarianism places upon us. First, the theory turns everything into a moral issue. What clothes should I wear today? Can't I just wear whatever I want? Not necessarily. From a utilitarian perspective, I must also take into account the effect of what I wear on everyone I might encounter. If what I wear is too flashy, expensive looking, that might make some feel envious and unhappy. If my outfit is tasteful, on the other hand, then my wearing it may produce a degree of utility. The point is that whatever I do affects others, and thus whatever I do qualifies as a moral issue under utilitarianism. Damn. But that doesn't seem right. Aren't most of our mundane choices simply morally neutral? Further, remember that for any set of choices there will always be some best choice, the choice that maximizes utility. According to ACT utilitarianism, I ought to reject other alternatives in favor of the best option. My choosing anything less would amount to my failing to act morally. Suppose I give $2 to a homeless man who really needs it. Haven't I done a good thing? For the utilitarian, probably not. After all, wouldn't $4 or $5 or $100 do a lot more good? Sure not take steps to provide a place for him to live. Sure, it might hurt me a bit to part with that kind of money, but if I'm not homeless, this... trying to do Australian. But if I'm not homeless, then this utility I experience probably won't compare to the benefits I could bring to that man. The contemporary ACT utilitarian Peter Singer, has argued along these very lines. His conclusion is that well-off Americans have a moral obligation to give a large portion of their income to help alleviate suffering in the rest of the world. One more example. Imagine yourself in a room where a terrorist suddenly tosses a hand grenade, and there's no time for anyone to escape. If you throw yourself on the grenade, you could save 10 other people from injury. If you don't, most will be badly hurt or killed. From a utilitarian perspective, it is your moral duty to sacrifice yourself for the sake of the others, unless someone beats you to it. Now, doing such a thing would certainly be morally praiseworthy. Your funeral eulogy would be glowing. But is it really your moral duty to sacrifice yourself in such a way? In fact, such acts of self-sacrifice are normally thought to fall beyond the call of duty. Yet act utilitarianism can't seem to recognize this difference. Act utilitarianism seems to demand that for every choice we make, we act as moral saints. This is because utilitarianism prescribes that act which produces the greatest overall utility. Act utilitarianism thus also encounters a problem with moral confirmation. It places demands upon us that extend beyond what even the best of us normally take to be our moral duty. It's hard to see how these problems can be avoided without changing the nature of the act utilitarianism principle itself. Moral permissiveness objection. Act utilitarianism yields intuitively correct answers to many moral questions. For example, it typically judges lying, murder, breaking contracts, and cheating to be morally wrong. Yet utilitarianism does not always yield results that agree with our moral intuitions. This is what I was talking about prior to this. The utilitarian reason for these intuitive deviations is simple. Circumstances do not always work out so that the kinds of acts we normally think of as right yield the greatest overall utility. Sometimes greater utility can actually be achieved by lying, breaking a promise, or even committing a murder. Thus, act utilitarianism can occasionally demand that we violate widely accepted moral beliefs. Imagine, for instance, that as executor of this estate, I promise a dying man that the $20,000 debt he incurred 40 years earlier will be paid. Suppose further that the debt is owed to a man who has since become the richest man on earth, and that this man has long forgotten all about it. Should I pay the debt? Wouldn't that money accomplish far greater good if it were invested in cancer research or given to the local soup kitchen? The dead man was... Did you catch that? I was going to try to do a Western accent. The dead man will certainly not be affected by what I do, and no one else witnessed my promise. Surely much greater overall utility could be achieved by my breaking the promise than by my keeping it. But would this be right? Many people feel very uncomfortable. 1 page left. Uncomfortable with cases like this. A promise is a promise, isn't it? Note also that the strangeness of the utilitarian's position here. It isn't simply that it might be okay for me to break my promise. Rather, act utilitarianism insists that I would actually be acting immorally if I kept my promise. Quite generally, if act utilitarianism were true, then any sort of action whatsoever could turn out to be my moral duty in the right and the sort of a government wants to assassinate a political leader who is making bad policy decisions, torture an enemy child to force the enemy to reveal important information or kill thousands. In short, act utilitarianism appears overly permissive in cases such as these. Given acting to blah 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 blah. Okay, there's more objections and blah blah blah. I'm tired. That was all. That was not all. That was like half of my homework done. I had to go into the bookstore at my school to buy this fucking book. $20 for this. And we're practically reaching the half point of the semester. And I don't get why she had to make us buy it. Oh, I just showed my school. I don't get why she had to make us buy it when teacher could literally post these readings online so that we could read them for free. And if they really wanted paper copies of the readings that we have, then we could just print it out ourselves. Like, why make me buy a $20 book just with a bunch of readings? Oh, and then she doesn't even collect the homework, so it's pretty useless at this point. I'm still going to do it though because we have a quiz tomorrow. But yeah. don't know what else to say. Let me know if I really sounded British, if I fooled you. I'm sorry for this video. I just woke up from a 2-hour nap. Came back from school. Crashed. I was supposed to go back out to do some errands. I might still do it, but it's dark outside. I'm not scared of dark. I'm just scared of the dark. No, I just can't see good in the dark, even with my glasses on. So yeah, maybe I'll still go back out and do some errands. Maybe I'll just stay here and chill and actually finish my homework.